We've been running a training program over a couple of years now to build capacity across the peatland research community, but we're joined very often by colleagues from policy and practice, so that we as a collective community can do better research and evidence gathering and use that evidence to achieve policy and practice change that can protect, restore and sustainably manage peatlands. And today we are joined by three illustrious speakers with a career behind each of them, a very different career behind each of them, working in a range of different contexts, but in particular in developing world contexts. Looking at conflict, cultural issues, practical issues of how we access sites and such like. There are some really challenging issues that we have to deal with in some of the very remote and challenged and often conflict-ridden environments in which we need to work as peatland researchers. And the goal of today's session is to hear from the lived experiences of Sue Page, Ritesh Kumar and Rupesh Bhomia, so that we can then both learn and discuss some of these issues together over what is left of this next hour. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. I'll stop sharing my screen and let Sue share hers as I introduce her. We're going to speak around about 10 minutes per person, and then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. But please do get your questions coming in the chat, and the speakers will answer some of those questions already in the chat after they have presented. So to Sue. Sue Page is a professor in the physical geography at the University of Leicester. She works on peatland ecosystems, both in the UK and in the tropics. And we'll be thinking in particular here about her experience in the tropics. She focuses on peatland land use and management, greenhouse gas emissions, land subsidence, among many other things. And she has been a partner in a range of multinational research programs and is currently looking at impacts of agricultural land uses on peat soils, in particular burdens caused by peat fires in Indonesia. We'll be hearing much more about that in a moment. So Sue, thank you for coming, and I am looking forward very much to hearing about your experiences and your theme today, which is on equity and fairness in international research. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction. It's very nice to be here with you all. And the first thing I think I need to say is this, you know, we've got 10-minute slots. So there's no way that I can cover everything that I might want to cover or that we should cover in relation to how we properly conduct international research. So I've just put together a few ideas which really feed very much on my own research experiences. Just a minute, slides are not moving on. So I think I've identified a few issues which I see with in potential issues for international collaborations. So how can we ensure that our research programs and practices do not disadvantage those with whom we collaborate? How can we ensure that high-income countries, which some of us come from, do not reap the greater benefits from global collaborations, whether that's authorships, numbers of papers published, ownership of ideas, samples, data, and so on? And also, how can we best negotiate and manage the political sensitivities of our research activities and research findings? So we can interpret that political in a variety of different ways, and I will just give one example, a couple of examples from my own experiences. So let's start with the whole research process. I think key to this, ensuring that there is equity and fairness, is to co-develop the research plan. So one example of how we managed to do this was that in advance of applying for UK research funding for a research programme in Southeast Asia, we brought together the key players. So we got some seed corn funding to bring everybody together, mixture of people from Southeast Asia, from various institutions in the UK to talk about what we thought the key issues were, the challenges, directions, particularly facing tropical peatlands in Indonesia. And as a result of that meeting, workshop over several days, we pulled together a paper which was published. And then when it came to applying for research funding, we were able to demonstrate that this was co-development, that what we wanted to do in our research programme had come out of that original workshop. So that's maybe one idea that you might be interested in pursuing. I think co-development of research and being able to demonstrate co-development and equity and full buy-in from all partners definitely benefits from pre-established and long-term relationships. So I think for early career researchers, getting those networks established, getting to meet people at workshops, at conferences, and so on, I think is key. You could also do that through contacting and reaching out to those who already have well-established networks and seeing if you can tap into those. So I know from my own research, I've definitely benefited from relationships which probably were established 20, even in some cases 30 years ago. And that helps to build up high levels of trust and integrity in the research team, and hopefully provides an opportunity for those who have concerns in whatever way about the research process. That long established relationship enables those people to feel empowered to speak, whether it's whichever direction that communication is going in. But I think nevertheless, we do have to be aware of what might be perceived to be hidden power dynamics, power asymmetries. They're hidden, so it's difficult to negotiate where those might exist and to find ways of dealing with those. But just because you're not aware of something doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't dig deeper and ensure that there really is a high level of integrity in what you're doing. And that leads on to how do we build in those checks and balances at different stages in the research process. I think also important, and this is something that we did very early on in the current research programme which I'm involved in, Kalimantan Lestari, which is looking at fire impacts on peatlands in central Kalimantan in Indonesia. I think key to getting buy-in from a whole range of different partners was developing this theory of change. This is a very simplified diagram which summarises where we see we're going, what our aims are, how we're going to achieve those aims, and also what the outputs might be and who might be affected by our research findings. So pulling together this theory of change, which we did over several days, and then also had the opportunity to discuss further at an in-person workshop last November, it enabled us to understand and share different viewpoints. And I think that was a really key way in avoiding or at least minimizing misunderstandings. Also getting teams to work across from the UK, working with people from Southeast Asia, different disciplines, different understandings, different viewpoints, hopefully avoids the concern around silos. I think it's also important in any research process to recognise positionality and to value local and Indigenous knowledge and understandings. We do need to value different viewpoints. Often when it comes to talking about positionality, this is something that really is central to social science research, but it's not often quite so central, or if appearing at all, in physical science research. And I do think that's important. So we need to recognise that some of us have certain privileges that relate to, for example, our backgrounds at education level and so on. And that will affect, that has an influence on research, whether it's in the physical sciences or the natural sciences. I had a research student a few years ago, Sarah Thornton, so some of you may know Sarah, have interacted with her. She undertook an interdisciplinary PhD, and I've just put together a few quotes from her thesis here, where she talks about co-development of methods, talks about positionality. And I think what you can see from Sarah's writing there is that it was a learning experience for everybody. Everybody was involved, the research assistants, played a key role in the design and testing of the methods used. So it was very much an interactive process in which everybody could bring and understand to the discussion, understand their different positions in the process. I think we also need to value local knowledge and understandings. And again, you might think that this mainly refers to social science projects, but I would disagree with that, because in Sarah's example, she was actually carrying out a research program which involved also looking at the ecology of fish communities, river fish communities in central Kalimantan. And she found that through incorporating local and cultural knowledge and experiences into her research, she was able to approach controversial topics such as the use of fire by fisherfolk, electric fishing, and so on. So I think that enabled her to explore different avenues well beyond those that she originally set out to research. And in my own experience, I have had to navigate the politics of research, and I think this is probably one of the most challenging areas of my own research. Has been being exposed to the political dimensions of research, even when in the first place our research has been purely based on scientific evidence collection. But then that evidence moves and the data moves out of that scientific sphere and moves into a political sphere. And that can be challenging because sometimes our results are subject to political distortions and manipulations to satisfy a specific agenda. An example of that is the work that I did on land use emissions associated with oil palm. And of course, that then moved into what was for me an unforeseen direction. It moved into European Commission reports on indirect impacts of land use change from biofuels, for example. Somebody who's written about this is Jenny Goldstein. And I think if you're interested in trying to navigate those politics, then reading her paper, Knowing the Subterranean, might be quite helpful. She talks about divergent knowledge. Divergent knowledge succeeds in shifting questions framing peatland land use away from where we as scientists want to centre it and places it in an area where sufficient doubt maybe around our research findings is generated, that this can actually sway regulatory regimes in the favour of perhaps development as opposed to conservation. Of course, as research scientists, we want to be objective. We've collected empirical data, but we can't control where that data and where that knowledge ends up and how it becomes used. So it's just a warning, really.
That's almost out of time. See, keep going. That's great.
Okay, I'm just going to finish on this slide, Mark. Thank you. So I haven't been able to cover the vast majority of topics, but I would just draw your attention to the Cape Town Statement on Fostering Research Integrity, and which has identified some key values, and I've put the link to the statement there. Thank you. Thank you all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sue. And you've apologized for not covering enough, but yeah, my goodness. So many great points and real food for thought, I think, for many of us. So if you have questions for Sue, please do start getting them coming into the chat. Sue will try and answer some of those via chat, but then we'll save those up for wider discussion later on. And as I said, I think it's real challenges. So I hope you're all thinking deeply already, which will put you in the place you need to be now to listen to Rupesh at Bhomia. So thank you so much, Rupesh, for making time to join us. Rupesh is a wetland biogeochemist at CIFOR, based in Indonesia. So Sue and he have worked together in the past. His research focuses on studying tropical freshwater swamps and coastal systems. In his PhD at the University of Florida, he studied biogeochemical transformation of nutrients in subtropical wetlands, so also a natural stroke physical scientist. Rupesh has worked in various places from Oregon State through the Peruvian Amazon, coastal mangroves in Honduras, India, Senegal, Liberia, Gabon, and he's also now working on climate change and blue carbon. A fascinating career in multiple peatland systems around the world, mainly in the developing world. So let's hear from you now and get a few of your perspectives on some of the tricky issues you've had to navigate. Looking forward to learning from you. Rupesh.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for this great introduction. Just reminded me of all the places I have been. It has been an incredible journey nonetheless. So can you see my slide? I try to make it full screen. Is it visible and am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I also would like to thank Sue for having a good start. Today, I am basically focusing this presentation to give more sort of practical aspects of doing field work and working in a country. And those examples, of course, bear some of the essence of my working in many developing countries, some for peatlands, some in case of mangroves. But here, all the examples, photos, and things are coming from Peru. And the idea behind is to kind of like drill down on the really practical nitty-gritties. If you are going to a country that you have not been to and you don't speak the language, how do you go about it? So it's more like a story and personal experiences, and I hope people do learn. So without further ado, okay, let me see if it moves. Yes. So I'll start with context, then we'll touch up a little bit about accessibility, communication, and then I'll touch on the equity aspect, which Sue has done a great job already covering, but just revisiting some of the topics, and then finally end on some of the impacts. So I think it is very important for all kind of researchers at any career is the intention. So before starting anything, you do need to just sit back and think about what you're proposing, what do you intend to do. And in many cases, as a researcher, we'd like to know more. So it's either data or information collection. But how are you going to do that? That plays a key role. And that's where the process comes into play. So what are the methodologies? What is the experimental design? Is there the sort of cutting edge in your area? Is there a room for improvement? So basically, it involves literature survey, what has been done. So thinking about them in a manner. And then important topic to decide right there is whether it's a biophysical area, whether ecological study, or whether it involves socioeconomic, or whether your research question involve both of them, because this has a huge bearing on the process, on the methodology that you're going to choose. So basically what I'm trying to say is that what you want to do, how you want to do, and where you want to do. Those are the three very important things that you have to answer. And as much clarity you have of all these things, the higher the chances of a success and a meaningful engagement and use of your time and resources. So location is important, where you want to do that study. So site is important. In case of if it involves physical data collection or meeting with communities, you do want to know what those places are. And then whether it involves specific communities, whether it also involves institutions. So all of these are very, very crucial when you set about working on your area. Once you have identified these important starting points, then the question comes of accessibility. This has to do, particularly working in developing countries, involve permissions. So whether you are able to visit those certain areas, do you need specific permits? If you are a foreign national like me, you have to get visas to enter country. So it depends on your nationality as a researcher, and also other people who are involved in the team. So you have to have time and thought process to get those visa and permission. whether those permission also involve collection of information, because it's maybe easy to go and visit, but are you able to bring back information? Are you able to bring back sample? Does it involve paying any fees? Do you need to pay for some of those activities, some of those research? Those all needs to be taken care of before you start. Then comes the logistics aspect. What is the mode of travel? In case of an international travel, of course, probably you will be flying. But when you are returning, are you able to bring the samples back on flight? Whether you are going to ship them back? How much time it will take for you to reach the site? If it is going to be a multiple day kind of event, where the ration would come from, what is the food? And so basically I'm touching these things which are very, very sort of commonsensical things. You do not pay attention, but this has a very important bearing on success of your field campaign, because you are often working with a limited budget, limited time, limited resources. So these all things are very important. And the last point here is the first aid or medical need, because you may be in a country very remote, and if some kind of urgent emergency happen, then you need to have thought about what would be the plan of action. And then at the timing of your work. So many times researchers or people may only be available to go out and conduct the data. Does that have an impact on the data that you are collecting because of the seasonality aspect? And you need to think about, in particular in countries, some areas people don't work on Sundays. So you can't just think about, like, I have 7 days and I want to be in the field every day and collect the data and come back. So these are very, very logical things, but you need to think about it. You have to also address some of your maybe fears or some of the challenges. These are some of the photos that I spotted in one field season of things. So if you are have a fear of snakes or leeches or centipedes or spiders, you need to be aware of that before being in the field. And then this is very important. We don't even think about it, but personal hygiene, toilets. When I was sampling in Peru, Amazon, there were no toilet, no bathroom. So you have to be okay with that. And then communication. Before you arrive at your location or country, you need to identify local partners who will be accompanying you in the field. How are we going to reach the site? If it needs a boat, have that boat been arranged? Whether you are going to travel by road, then what vehicle will take you to those sites? Then when you are there, then you do need to design and select your team. Most likely you'll be working with local team. You need to, what Sue was saying, not only co-design your research, but also identify the team with good gender balance. You may need to train them with, maybe if you're using questionnaire, maybe you're using some kind of equipment, you need to make sure that they know how to use it. Then identifying key roles and responsibilities. Sometimes a team need to be break into 2-3 subgroups. So each one should know. And then they should be very much clear of the purpose. So it's not that you have to basically control everyone, but everyone is part of team with same sort of level of responsibility roles, and be able to take quick action or decision when needed, when they know the overall purpose of that particular effort. And then once that is done, after your field work is done, you have done conducted the research or data collection, then you should thinking about how would you update or communicate the progress of that work. How would you share the result? How would you collaborate those people who were involved in publication reports or things that will come out of it? So this all fall in the communication. Then the equity aspect, which I think Sue has covered everything under that larger topic. But I just wanted to add a few bullet points about the agency of people who are involved. So there is a term which you hear is about ethics and free prior informed consent. So if you are collecting data, if you are interviewing communities, do they consent to be part of this survey? Does everyone in your team or in the group have equal opportunity of learning? Is it a participatory process, or is it inclusive? That's my point, right? Like, is it inclusive at the process of data collection or research, or whether in the process of outputs it also includes? What are the opportunities of personal growth? So from Peru, in this photo, you see some of these volunteers went ahead and did their masters and PhD. So during the process, that learning was there, that empowered them to think about further education. So you have to think about those things. And then ownership. At the end, who owns the data that you collected? Whether that is open access, whether it will be available for other researchers who may not have played any role in your work, or whether it will be some intellectual property which is just a part of your university or lab group. So you have to think about these things, and that can be explored during your co-design process. And then you have to think about impact. So when it starts with intent in the beginning, but it should be very clear on what are the impacts. Is this a research that will lead to some kind of solving a problem, whether local or at a national level or a larger level? How it links to policies, and then benefit sharing, who benefits. I think I am almost on my time, but this is just last slide. So you have to think about the linkages with governance. What are the mechanisms? And I think Ritesh will cover some of the challenges and opportunities on those aspects. So I don't need to talk about it, but it is very, very important that these impacts are translated and transmitted to the people who are the recipients. And as a researcher, we have to have that clarity from the beginning. So that's all I have to say. There are some photos from the picture. One important thing just I want to leave you with is that you have to be with your team members working in. You can't be sitting somewhere and telling, go collect the soil and walk in the water. You have to play that role. And that's the real fun part of the research. So with that, thank you, Mark.
Amazing. Thank you, Rupesh. And yeah, clearly huge challenges, personal sacrifice, and yet connection, fun, and I think we can all take lessons from you into how to swim with a brimmed hat on as well. Great. So as with Sue, please, if you have questions, add them into the chat for Rupesh and Sue, and we're going to move on to Ritesh, and he's going to build on this, thinking about some of the challenges in terms of governance, mainstreaming ideas. So he'll touch on some of the points that both Rupesh and Sue have made and go into more depth in this final segment. But to just introduce Ritesh, he is Director of Wetlands International South Asia. So Ritesh has led integrated management planning for a whole load of different wetlands across the South Asia region, and works on wetland assessment, ecosystem service evaluation, water management, sustainable livelihoods, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. And so you'd expect, as the director of an organization like this, very interdisciplinary in his expertise. But also very engaged in the policy community, working on a range of different global, regional, national assessments, most recently on the global peatlands assessments, along, I think, with all of us who are leading today. And yeah, so Ritesh, over to you. Again, a wealth of experience in a range of different and often very challenging contexts. And yeah, looking forward to learning from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for this very considerate introduction. My presentation builds on Sue's important statement on positionality to understand where do we come from and how do we present or interpret our findings, and also Rupesh's excellent case of how do we reflect into decision making. And perhaps in most of the research that I've seen or practical field where governance is seen as an afterthought, what I present here is my own learnings from interdisciplinary approaches to wetland management on how could you frame your research or management choices in a way that recognizes the importance of the social dimensions of research quite early on. But let's understand the whole trajectory, and it's not just peatlands. The subject is fairly evolving, the whole area of wetland conservation. In the 60s, the concerns were around in the United States around migratory birds, and you had these famous duck stamps being issued for people to go and shoot ducks. I'm sure you'd have one of these collector stamps, $1 stamps, and the funds would sit in a reserve which would be used to protect wetlands, but not for their carbon or water benefits, but it was being able to shoot more ducks in the coming days. But from there, and we now speak of the biodiversity crisis, the Living Planet Index, which talks about wetland and freshwater species. We are looking at the positioning of wetlands as the bloodstream of biosphere. How does this connect to water, food, and climate security, and also to rather seemingly disparate things such as peace and security being connected to the degradation of resources. So the subject itself is greatly evolving, and I'm afraid that a physical sciences dominated research is very ill equipped to frame these challenges in a more meaningful way to the society. And you would see this. I made this slide to demonstrate that where are wetlands sitting and peatlands sitting in the international MEAs. Believe me, this is just one segment of the multiple commitments we have, but talk about the CBD-led Global Biodiversity Framework or the Heritage Convention, Central Asian Flyway. The old classical conservation community is calling for more conservation, but the new demand for conserving peatlands management is coming from frameworks such as Sustainable Development Goals or HIOGO, which is speaking of ecosystems and DRR, or United Nations Environment Assembly. So the reason why I show this slide is that demand for conservation research is not just emanating from classical conservation school, which where people were interested in species and habitats, but it is also very much closely connected with community, which demands research on ecosystems to fulfill things such as disaster risk reduction, a cooler climate, a cooler planet, and so on. So firstly, let's recognize that we all come from a position. And any science, any research that we publish or talk about comes from our interpretation of an elephant. And we value nature in different ways. It could be, as an ecologist, we might value it in terms of species and habitats, but from a community scientist, we could be expressing something very different. So I've been with communities where they express nature is us and we are nature. Now that's very different from a researcher sitting outside the system and trying to decode a peatland in terms of carbon or species. The moment you switch to an understanding that you are nature and nature is you, you live into a different reality altogether. And it is important to recognize that there are diverse ways of knowing nature. There are diverse ways of knowing peatland, and each of us try to impose a worldview, interpret a worldview, but to whatever specificity we arrive at, it is but a very partial framing of the whole reality. And let's recognize this limitation and be humble in whatever we preach and practice. Secondly, so how do we connect these elements? So traditionally, it is encouraged that we look at, even if there are seemingly landscapes which are seemingly devoid of people, to look at these systems as coupled systems. So there is ecology as an ecological sense. We have species, communities, the things that connect ecosystem processes. But remember, there are people dependent directly or indirectly on these systems. And they have their own ways of connecting through infrastructure, assets, but also norms, belief systems, formal and informal, institutions. And the way choices are made is very central. So a community which decides to not to harvest peatland, their governance system, to a community which respects a peatland because of a cultural connection as a sacred grove. Now that is core to understanding. And unless you interpret a system in terms of the ecology, the society, and governance, a fuller description of the problem does not emerge. And I'll strongly encourage that when we define a system, the first thing is to look at ecology, look at society, and look at how decision making is done. And then how do you define character of a system? So the Ramsar Convention encourages that we manage ecosystems for wise use, and wise use is maintenance of ecological character. So I say, let's frame this problem in 3 levels. We look at the components that I showed about, the biotic, the abiotic, the society, and look at the interactions at a certain level. Now, these interactions could be very ecological. For example, biomass decomposition and accumulation is something that is happening almost in an ecological world. But look at people harvesting resources using seasonality as a reference. Now, that is where society and human interactions takes place. So let's map those interactions as well. And together with these interactions and communities, the system acquires a character, which then becomes the focus of the research. So and again, this is not to draw a line around something and say that this is it, this is the species. All of this is going to be porous. Any system design is nothing but a hypothesis on how the system functions. So let's be very clear on our hypothesis. Now, thirdly, let's come to the management. Now, management is about two things. We either tend to create an enabling condition around an ecosystem, which is hydrology or species migration corridors, or even community behavior or sustainable livelihood interactions, or around threats. Now, both of these should be attempted in the same frame to achieve wetland wise use. And remember, to do this, you also need to reflect on the external environment which regulates our capability to intervene, which is the policies, sector mainstreaming efforts, participation, financing, and enabling governance. And that suddenly makes the canvas of the problem slightly complicated, but fuller to be delivering wetland conservation in today's complex world. And finally, the convention speaks of maintaining ecological character, which might sound like maintaining a state, maintaining a desired condition. To me, and again, this comes from ages of practice, rather than trying to drive a system towards a fixated condition, we should rather achieve that the system behaves in certain boundaries, and those boundaries are ecologically set and socially set. You could talk of a peatland system's integrity in terms of its ecosystem processes, a particular carbon accumulation rate, the extent, the hydrological connectedness. You could also think of similar threshold in terms of equity. So does maintaining climate or peatland connectivity, what implication does it have for social equity, for gender, inclusion? And set your thresholds, not only just in terms of ecology, but in terms of sociology, the way people connect. A meaningful wetland management today has not only to deliver on good conservation, good habitat, species conditions, but also these systems are more inclusive, respectful of different knowledge systems, and they are interdisciplinary in true letter and spirit. So that's where I wanted to close by saying 4 messages. One is that governance is what ultimately influences the way a coupled system will behave. If you're sitting in a very top-down system where regimes are directed from the top, very disconnected from the bottom, you might do good conservation at the cost of huge social conflict. Again, we should recognize that governance is not something people sitting in capital do. It is happening right at the village level. It is happening right at household level. It is happening right at village level, community level, and the districts and so on. And thereby coordination and stakeholder integration are critical ingredients of any management research. And especially these systems, we have to have capability to adapt as new information comes in, and also be anticipative of facing complexity. We are looking at a complex system. Things might appear simple because of our simple hypothesis. In reality, things might change. And finally, our ability to deliver on wise use is closely dependent on degree of fit between ecosystems and governance systems. So if an ecosystem is complex, perhaps simple governance solutions is not an option. Governance may have a polycentric direction, distributed across time, distributed across space. So with these thoughts, I think I'll hand over the session back to Mark and look forward to questions, clarifications, if any. Thank you so much, Mark, for this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Ritesh. Fascinating, and like both of the other 2 speakers, so much food for thought. Sue, if we've all got your cameras on. Thank you very much. So, questions for any or all of our speakers, and we can see nothing in the chat. So, I'm going to invite you to raise a hand. Before putting a question to the speakers, though, I wonder if I can put a question to you as an audience. So I think certainly Sue and Rupesh, primarily natural scientists, Ritesh much in that kind of interdisciplinary space. But I think one of the things that really strikes me here is that as an environmental social scientist, I'm in theory trained to think about positionality and many of these issues to value local knowledge and to interrogate that through interviews and focus groups and write that up as a research. And that is very different for most of you who are natural or physical scientists. And I think part of the message here is, yeah, there's social science that goes and does that, and maybe that's not quite you. But you still need to take account of these different ways of understanding the world, of understanding the contexts that you are researching, the questions that others have and how they see the world if we are to do research which is responsible. And we all need to be aware of our own positionality, whether or not we necessarily write that up in our papers, if that's not appropriate for the kind of journals we're publishing in. And so, yeah, those of you who are natural physical scientists, reactions, do you buy that? Do you see the value of that? Do you feel, yeah, not necessary? What has this provoked for you? So if I can invite anyone to write their reactions in the chat or to raise a hand. And also, if you have a question, to raise your hand as well. And one of the reasons I ask this is I know that we do tend to have a slightly biased attendance to this sort of more kind of natural physical compared to social scientists. So I'm guessing there's a few of you who have hopefully been challenged in a good way, but over to you. So reactions, or if you prefer, a question for one of our speakers. So I'll give you some typing time if that's what you'd like to do. I do have a question for Ritesh, which I'll kick off with in a moment, but I'd like to see if you've got anything first. And if there isn't yet, then let's ask if I can ask Ritesh my question. And I'm guessing Sue and Rupesh may have some views on this as well. I was fascinating in this diagram that you showed with this kind of socially acceptable space within which, or socially desirable, I think you called it, space in which we can try and work, and where we're trying to find these win-wins. And I'm wondering what you do, and if you can give us some examples from your work in Wetlands International, where you have different communities for whom what is desirable looks very different. And especially when at least one of those communities, their version of what is a desirable space for them to operate and their livelihoods, perhaps through very extractive practices, is at odds with what would be compatible for conservation, and how that model works in these very conflicted spaces that we often end up working in.
Thanks, Mark. And my realization of working on these complex situations is there is no win-win ever. There are only trade-offs. How you negotiate is the challenge that determines outcomes. So to narrate it to one of the real-life experiences that I'm going through, some 25 years back, there's this peatland in Northeast India, wherein we discovered that the hydrology had completely altered and we need to restore hydrology. The problem was this altered hydrology was suiting hydropower production. So, and in this energy deprived state, if you're going back to natural hydrology, you're losing on power. So 25 years back, we rewrote a barrage operation policy saying that, okay, if you open the gates in a particular way, this is what possibly would benefit nature. But down the line, negotiating this has taken me about 20 years of my life. And now there are new actors. So there are capture fishers who say that, yes, we need the natural regime, but there are also culture fishers who have adapted to a new regime. So now you are into a situation that, yes, you can reclaim nature, but now there are more losers than what were 3 decades back. And that the program needs to provide for alternate or additional livelihoods, build in more negotiation space, and demonstrate why going back to nature is beneficial in the long run. And it's just not doing plain ecology, it's also about communicating through politicians, through local leaders, what hydrology means, and that has been a journey of its own. So thereby I say that rather than trying to achieve something very static, we need to be conscious that every action may have a social implication or an ecological implications. Perhaps as conservation scientists or conservation people, community, we are more comfortable in the ecological space. That's our home ground. We know that language. The trick is when you enter into places of, poverty reduction, losses of jobs, food insecurity, gender inclusion, and thereby we find ourselves ill-trained. At least I was very ill-trained to handle those situations in reality, but it has taken a lot of time sitting with community leaders, politicians, to explain how this ecosystem behaves and why going back to nature might be the best option while providing for alternates. So that's where I come from. And going also back to your interesting question, Mark, not to hog the entire time, is have the willingness to learn concepts from different disciplines. So as an ecologist, the simple concepts like species richness might seem very comfortable to you. It might be interpreted very differently by an economist who is used to different metrics. Willingness to learn each other's language is perhaps the foundation of any work we do in conservation today.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and I think many of us are increasingly aware of that and understand how to do that between disciplines. And it is exactly the same skill when it comes to then understanding these languages and ways of knowing of perhaps some of the local communities you might be engaging with as well. I'm going to, if I may, ask a question directly to Sue to unpack something quite controversial. So Sue, both of us are white privileged professors from British institutions, and you talk very clearly about what we should do in terms of that positionality. And I think many of the things that you were talking about are part of a broader narrative on decolonializing research. And I think as British citizens, having just celebrated the coronation of a king, with a long history of colonialism, I think this is particularly pertinent to us and others like us. And I've been doing what I can in very limited ways. I'll put a link to a paper that is open for authorship if anyone is interested in on alternatives to the word stakeholder. But at the far extreme of this, it's been suggested to me that I should in fact not be publishing. Certainly when it comes to these kind of more tricky issues around racism or decolonialization, on the basis of my positionality, that in fact, if I try and publish on this, that in itself is a form of racism known as white centering. And that I need to get out of the way to make room for authors from the affected countries to be leading these publications instead. And I found that very challenging. And I don't know if you've ever had that and what you would say to that, Sue. I can give you my response first or after if you like, if that's helpful. But yeah, it's tricky, and there needs to be a rebalancing of these power dynamics.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it is really tricky. And I think it's particularly tricky for, as you said, Mal, people who come from a natural science background, because they're not usually exposed to this way of thinking and contextualizing their work in that way. So yes, post-colonial debates are very much held have been very much held within the social science space. And I think it's time we moved out of that thinking. That, as physical scientists, we need to be as aware, if not even sometimes more aware, of these debates and how we can negotiate our way through what might be quite tricky, research processes. I don't think any of this is easy. I don't think anybody wants to pretend there is an easy way. I think what you have to, it's awareness. And I was very struck, by talking about we have to understand the different ways of measuring, ways of talking, understand different approaches that come from social sciences and so on, maybe even from economics and so on. So I think it's just opening our minds to those discussions. I don't think it means that once you've done that, you've immediately got some sort of, hey, open sesame, something immediately has happened that will make it easy for you to go forward into negotiating in these areas. And I think it has to be a two-way dialogue as well. And I think it's very difficult sometimes to, I talked about those hidden barriers, and hidden, sort of the dynamics of balance between, different groups of researchers. And I do think it's difficult to negotiate because we can't put ourselves in the shoes of other people who may have concerns, but don't feel themselves empowered to actually discuss or bring those concerns to the table. So that it isn't easy, and I can see Ritesh, nodding there. That I think it's that. I think the first step is being aware and being open to challenge. I'm not saying that if you then are aware of it, that therefore you've immediately got some sort of menu that you can follow that will, wipe the slate clean and remove all this positionality. And I think positionality is something that we should be aware of. It doesn't matter where we're researching. It doesn't matter whether I'm researching in the fens of Eastern England. I should be equally aware of my positionality in those locations. So I think if we can apply these approaches, whatever we do and wherever we do it, that might be a good starting point.
Yeah, and I think there are no simple answers. So this is not a head thing of these are the steps I should follow. It's a heart thing, and I think what you are doing is getting us to think at that much deeper level about where we stand and what work we might need to do internally to become more deeply aware of these issues, so that we can adaptively respond. Emma's asked a question in the chat, and I wondered, Rupesh, if you might be able to give us an example of a situation where you had to balance those power dynamics. And then I've got a couple more. We'll see how the time goes. Questions are now coming in, so that's great. Rupesh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you for that question, Emma. I am not 100% sure whether this will be a complete or satisfactory answer. I'll try to give you an example, particularly from work in Peru. And what's interesting is Eurydice is also one of the attendees today who I work with closely as a part of IAPE, Institute Peruana in Iquitos. So I think the way to do and reduce that polarity in or power dynamics is always try to involve local institution. And we were really lucky, at least in this case, that there were good researchers there. In case of Eurydice, she really helped me identify the team, make sure that where we are going, we have permission, we got approvals from the local institution. And then in my case, I was more on the biophysical side, so it involved less of community involvement, which helped. But I would say that the rule of thumb is to be inclusive. Try to get as many voices, as many perspectives as you can. And then if I can just use one more minute, and I'm touching to what Sue and Ritesh was talking. Sometimes in countries, when we're talking specifically for today's topic was developing countries, the budget for research is always very low. So you may want the local realities, or the question of positionality comes into play where the money is coming from that research. So if it is not coming from, say, a European grant or a big grant that can support all these meetings and visits and lab analysis and all of that, does that country itself has the wherewithal, whether it's a capacity, whether as in terms of institution, whether researchers, to be able to do that? So I think this is an open question. I'm not seeking the easy answer right away, but we do need to recognize, and then I think the intent plays a major role. So even if the funding agency is coming from Global North, but if the intention is right, if it is for the greater good, if it is for conservation, preservation of environment and society, then I think we are on the right path. How long it takes is a different question, but at least we are moving in the right direction. I'll end there. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. And we are coming to the end, so briefly, if I may, I'd like to invite Ritesh to conclude with some closing thoughts on what you've heard in this discussion so far.
Thanks, Mark. I think Rupesh brilliantly said that conservation sciences today is about bridging nature and society. And that means that the ways of knowing, describing, or assessing the problem, or even finding solutions, has to be collaborative, has to be inclusive. And I think that's the strongest message that has come through. So at the end of the day, if people who are listening to this conversation, I'd be encouraged when an ecologist walks over to the social sciences department to say, okay, can we measure species richness together in metrics that we both understand and the communities can connect to? So that's where the life is. Environment is increasingly getting complex and coupled. I think these barriers around departments and silos are something increasingly getting irrelevant in a world which is so teleconnected, so coupled. The new research and the emerging research that is needed to solve these complexities has by nature to be transdisciplinary, evolving different realms of people and expertise and knowledge systems, and which is respectful of knowledge holders at every level.
Great.
So I think, Mark, I'm so inspired. Handing it over to you.
Thank you, and I echo that inspiration. It has been fascinating. Thank you, Ritesh, Rupesh, and Sue. And thank you, Jane, who has helped to organise this. This would not have been possible without you. We would love to know what you thought of this. And in the chat, you can also see links to all of the previous sessions, and you can follow all of our speakers on Twitter. This, sadly, is the last of these training sessions, at least for a while. However, we are planning a new series of sessions, which is going to be around evidence synthesis, training people in evidence synthesis and writing policy briefs. And so this is going to be a training series with a twist, because we will be answering real questions from real policymakers and turning them into policy briefs to send back to these people and hopefully really make a difference. So if you want to find out more about that, stay in touch with our activities, you can join the research working group via the link in the chat. Just remains for me to say thank you to all our speakers and to Jane, and enjoy the rest of your day.